Welcome to Manifold. Today my guest is Gilles Saint-Paul, Professeur à l'École Normale Supérieure. After receiving engineering degrees from Ecole Polytechnique in 1985 and the École des Ponts et Chaussées in 1987, Saint-Paul graduated with a master's degree in applied mathematics from Paris Dauphine University. He then earned his PhD in economics in 1990 at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I'm very happy to have you on the show.
Thank you. Yes, very glad to.
Great. Now, I came across your 2008 paper on mating and hypergamy, which I found very impressive, and it's something that I wanted to discuss in this interview. We'll get to that in the second half. That led me to your blog, which I also found very fascinating. I found your essays very insightful. And also, I've always been curious about the French Grande École system. And so I thought I would ask you also about some aspects of that, the education system in France. Does that sound like a reasonable set of topics?
Of course, yes.
Great. So let's start with your childhood and educational career. Maybe just tell us a little bit about where you grew up and what it was like.
Yeah, well, I'm from a sort of regular family, a regular middle-class family from the provinces, not Paris. My grandfather was a tiny textile manufacturer, very tiny, actually. He died with zero wealth, didn't even own his car, but he was very respected in his village. My maternal grandfather was from military dynasty, artillery officers, actually. So they were more from the upper middle class, if you want. And they were from the south of France, near Marseille, basically. So my father and his brothers and sisters sort of went up the social ladder through the education system. And my father married my mother when he was doing his military service in Salon de Provence, which is basically an air base, Air Force base town near Marseille. This is where my mother grew up. And then, they did very standard middle-class things. My father was working in a steel company, steel plant, then a computer company, and then he moved to an American company, the Reader's Digest, basically. And my mother is an Italian teacher in high school. So not a particularly interesting background, to put it that way. People who survive well thanks to the educational system, but are not particularly connected. And so basically, what else can I say? I was doing very well at school at that time in science. I was very good in math and physics. And when I graduated from high school, I didn't know what to do. So I did what was the obvious thing in France, which is preparing for those grandes écoles. And then I went to Polytechnique. And at the end of Polytechnique, I didn't know what to do. I actually considered opening a restaurant, but instead, I went to a semi-standard path, which is that I actually specialized in the last class I took that was interesting to me as an undergrad. And so I started a thesis in economics because I thought it was very interesting to apply mathematics to human phenomena, basically. And then I met a guy called Jean Tirole, and he told me, go to MIT. So I went to MIT. And then at the end of my PhD, I was planning to do a more bureaucratic career than I finally did. So I met another guy called Roger Guénery, who told me, come to this research center in Paris and be an academic. And so this is what I did, basically. At the end of the day, I took very few autonomous decisions in my life, in some sense. Most of the time, I did what I was supposed to do or told to do. It may sound quite un-American, but it's not uncommon in France, and I suspect in Asia it's even more common.
Yes. Could you comment a little bit on how you found MIT and the American system of education versus what you had experienced in France?
I found it very similar. There was a methodology. I came from this preparatory school to Polytechnique, and this is something where you don't really, well, it's a very good education, but you don't really grow up in some sense. You work, you have exams, you have problem sets. And meanwhile, the American undergrads, they enjoy themselves. But if they go to graduate school, they no longer enjoy themselves. They have problem sets and assignments again. And so I found the atmosphere and the methods of education quite similar to France. Now, there are lots of American guys, not lots, but some American PhD students who were a bit scared about that because it was new to them. But to me, it was not new at all. I was almost disappointed to some extent. Not by the contents, of course, but the system looked so similar.
Now, one of the places where there's a big difference between the American system and the French system is, I believe you guys, for 2 years after you finish high school, you get your bac, you prepare, you engage in some things called the prépas in order to be admitted to these Grande Écoles. Is that correct?
Right. So basically, these Grande Écoles, they are based on the principle of Republican equality, which means that no favoritism, no nepotism, no donors, we take the best people according to objective academic criteria. And for this, everybody has to take a contest, which has to be calibrated to be, hard enough or discriminating enough so that there's no ambiguity about who is better than whom. So that is the principle, historically. And we borrowed that system from the Chinese in the 18th century, when the Jesuit missionaries went to China and they talked about that to, philosophers of the Enlightenment who said, look, that's a great thing to do in an egalitarian society. In some sense, France borrowed this system of contest from the Chinese, basically. But then over time, in some sense, accessing these positions through those contests proved an interesting thing to do. And for that reason, those prépas, as they are called, arose gradually over time because people spent more effort in order to win the contest, in order to succeed in the contest. So on the one hand, such contests are indeed, very equitable, no favoritism. On the other hand, they create some artificial scarcity. And this means that, people are competing with each other very hard to get into those schools. And furthermore, these things are getting worse. These things got worse in recent years for two reasons. One is that the labor market deteriorated starting in the mid-70s. Meaning that you are willing to work harder to secure your economic position in society. And the other thing is that the regular university, which is still training most of the students, was gradually degraded over time because following May 1968, more and more people could enter universities without being selected. So a lot of the success of the Grandes Écoles, in my view, come from the fact that it's becoming less and less interesting to go to university. In particular, the baccalaureate, well, about the baccalaureate, historically, is nationwide exam, which is an entry ticket to universities. So you cannot go to the university unless you have the baccalaureate. And so because of, socialist demagogues, we moved from a situation where 20% of a cohort had the baccalaureate to a situation where 80% of the cohort had the baccalaureate. So the number of people who were allowed to go to university was multiplied by 4. And this made it increasingly attractive to go to the Grandes Écoles instead, because going to the university was not giving a very interesting signal about your quality as a worker to prospective employers.
What fraction of students attend a Grande École?
This I don't know. It's not that small, because among the Grandes Écoles, you have many small écoles. So I would say total, because we have business, Grandes Écoles, we have engineering. So total, it's not negligible, maybe 10% total.
I see. Yeah, that's
but
pretty.
among
That's
the so-called
pretty.
Grandes Écoles, some of them are, quite specialized. It's not that difficult to get in, and you don't get that a great job when you go out.
There's a study that I did with a colleague where we counted the number of Nobel Fields and Turing Awards won by the alumni of different undergraduate institutions. And the highest density is among the graduates of Ecole Normale. And number 2 in the world is Caltech. Number 3 is probably Harvard. And then Polytechnique is probably somewhere in the top 10, close to Cambridge and Oxford.
Yes.
I don't know if you had ever heard those statistics. I think there was very little interest in our results from American university presidents, but a guy called Marc Mazard, who's a theoretical physicist, and
Marc, I know him very well. He was the director of Ecole Normale Supérieure.
Yeah, he found our results very interesting, but I think Americans didn't care so much. But I was very impressed by the high density at ENS.
Yeah, it's all the more impressive that it's a much smaller institution than Harvard or Oxford or Cambridge. In science, they take some 50 students per year. So it's really, the crème de la crème, if you want. At the same time, it's not so surprising they are doing so well, because all the top students self-select to go there. Nobody, except those who prefer to go to Polytechnique, nobody would give up going there. I guess in the US, you have students who are very strong, but they prefer to go to Stanford and to Harvard or, something like that. So you have more similar institutions. In France, there is a pretty rigid hierarchy.
Do you teach these students at ENS?
I do, yes. They are not monstrous. Most of I teach in a specific section which they created in the 1980s, I believe, which is called social science. So these are historically they had, science nerds and humanities nerds, like people who were devoting their lives to 13th century poetry, people like that. Or people who are super strong at solving tough mathematical problems, but they could not tie their shoes. But this social science category is much more balanced. They are more like, they are not stellar in any specific field, but they are good in every field. So it's a pretty different kind of people. Many of them go to business or administration. Some of them become very good economists. Actually, Esther Duflo went through this, and a number of other people. But they do not have a typical profile of the Ecole Normale student historically, who is super strong in a very limited field, in a very narrowly defined field. And so, there's nothing special about teaching there, to be honest. They are like, advanced students from Princeton or something like that.
Got it. Now, in this essay that I read, which is titled On the Yellow Vest Insurrection and dated December 2018, by the way, I'm curious, do you also write a blog in French, or your blog is in English?
It's in English. Then why do I write so much in English about France, you might say, you might ask? Maybe because I want to take off some heat, I guess.
I see. Well, I'm very happy you write in English.
1 million people to read my blog, it might create some trouble for me. So.
Okay, so if it were in French, there would be more blowback.
Yeah, exactly. There could be. At least, that's my perception.
Good. Yeah, you're probably right.
I think I do useful job sort of informing the rest of the world of those things.
Yeah, I was quite glad to find your blog. Let me read the first few sentences from this blog post, and then maybe you can elaborate. You write, "The current insurrection is the result of a number of ideological, political, and economic forces, which gradually made life unlivable for the French lower middle class. How did we get here? It all started with a long cultural battle waged by the left in order to conquer and maintain hegemony." And when I read that, I was hooked. So please elaborate.
France is a sort of catch-all welfare state where everybody has an entitlement on resources produced by others. Okay. That's one way to view it. So there is, in fact, a pecking order, which is not official. Okay. But basically, the people who are at the bottom of that pecking order, they are fooled. They are told that they are going to get what they are promised, but it's not actually true. And this is what the yellow vest realized. They realized that they have been fooled, basically. So they have been told, look, you are going to have a great, the best health system in the world. And then someday the maternity closes or the intensive care unit closes. Then they are told it's not profitable. This is why we close these things. We are managers. But then the day after, they turn on the TV and they are told about all these wonderful cultural festivals that take place in the south of France that are not profitable any more than the maternity that was closed, of course. These festivals are even less profitable than the maternity. So then they scratch their head and they ask themselves, what's going on? Why is it that my maternity is less important than the futile distractions of the bourgeois people who attend those festivals? And the answer to that question is that they are at the bottom of the pecking order. These festivals, the cultural system, the cultural complex is important in maintaining the ideology of the middle class that supports the government. So this is why it's higher in the pecking order than the maternity of the yellow vests. So basically, what made this insurrection dangerous to the power is that these people were not fighting to improve their situation within the system. They were actually fighting the system. Very different. And they were fighting the system because they realized that the system was based upon them being at the bottom. So this is the way it works. Now, why the left? The theory that I'm pushing here is that during the high growth of the post-war era, the proletariat, as they call it, was, experiences a very substantial improvement in living standards. And so these people were starting to be homeowners, going to vacations and so forth. And the left realized that they would lose gradually the support of this proletariat. I think to some extent the same thing took place in the United States, but instead of having a strategy of constructing your access to power based on vertical conflicts, They changed their strategy and they tried to use horizontal conflicts, basically. Men versus women, and natives versus immigrants, and so on and so forth. So there was a shift there. And this shift implied that the former proletariat was no longer a social category that was favored by the left. And that is the reason why they ended up at the bottom of the pecking order.
So you write that in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, the left still valorized the proletariat.
Yes.
But perhaps something happened around 68 with the student protests. How did it actually occur that they gave up on?
What happened before 68 is that the proletariat sort of became less of a proletariat because of economic growth, basically. So it was increasingly difficult for the left to convince these people that they were oppressed and that they should, participate in social unrest when, their wages grew 5% per year and they were buying a house in the suburb of Paris. It was no longer credible to say those things. Now the student unrest, that's a very specific phenomenon. But basically, it's the lines of conflicts that changed around that time. The political factions that I call the left redefined those lines of conflicts in order to have a chance to keep power. And they were relatively successful. But it took time, basically. It started because the male students could not enter the girls' dormitories. So, it was a sort of, adolescent movement. They wanted to relax social constraints on their behavior.
I'm sorry, you're saying that was the cause of the 68 student protests?
Yes, it was the immediate cause of 1968.
I see.
And then it went out of control and it was crazy. These people were demonstrating with pictures of Chairman Mao Zedong saying we want no constraints. So we want to enjoy life without constraints. I don't think Mao Zedong is the best incarnation of that kind of philosophy. So it was just something crazy in terms of ideology, but it sort of overturned the preceding social order.
Now, in the US, I would say it seems to me the left still sided with the labor unions well into the 70s and perhaps even the 80s. And was that not true in France?
They still do in France. It's just that the labor unions do not represent. Well, first of all, the unionization rate has fallen tremendously. And that's because the labor unions do not represent people like the Gilets jaunes. So the labor unions are almost a branch of the government, if you want. They are the branch of the government which is taking care of communication with those workers who are relatively well treated by the system, like public sector workers, big companies workers, people like that. These are not the Gilets jaunes.
So the Gilets jaunes are working poor? Is that the right way to characterize them?
Yes, working poor, small entrepreneurs, people who pay a lot of the taxes that fund social. Yes, people who bear the burden of risk, and they are said to be the losers of globalization, if you want. But that's an interesting debate because the so-called winner of globalization in France, like the cultural industry, they are not winners of globalization. They go on being protected against globalization. Okay, so you have this government. They say to textile workers, look, you have to compete in the global arena. And it means that given that there are all those low-cost countries, we need to reduce employment in your sector by 70%, something like that. At the same time, they are going to say, look, culture is very important for democracy, blah, blah, blah. So we continue to subsidize culture. If nobody was protected, the non-yellow vest people many of them would find themselves losers from globalization. And conversely, many of the yellow vest people, they would pay their gasoline at world market prices instead of paying 150% tax on this. So it's not clear at all that these people are losers from globalization. They are losers from government policy, which is a different thing.
Is this insurrection just on pause now, waiting for another spark to ignite it?
Many people think so, but the repression was pretty brutal by, of course, it was not that brutal by historical standards. There were no things, but still lots of people were mutilated. They lost an eye because the police was instructed to shoot these tear gas grenades directly to the faces of the people. So there was a sort of unprecedented repression. And that's because it was a new kind of protest. And an important thing they asked was a referendum, direct democracy.
Is your interpretation of these events allowed in the mainstream media in France, or would it be considered very unseemly for a professor to say these things?
It's allowed, but it's better if you say it in a not so visible outlet. And if you are yourself not so close to the center of power. That's one way to put it. Okay?
Do you feel that your family background allows you to understand better the world of these Gilets jaunes?
I'm not sure. To some extent. But on the other hand, you have lots of people. If we take Macron, okay, president of France, his family background is not from the top Parisian bourgeoisie, nor from people who are all civil servants or all academics, every generation, not at all. So family background only plays a minor role, I think. I don't have a good explanation to give you, but it depends on how you identify yourself. Okay? Well, one of the guys who went to Polytechnique with me was from a very, very peasant background. And then he went to ENA, which is the top school for administration. And he was co-opted by these people who are very bourgeois. And as a result of that, he was extremely grateful to this caste that had co-opted him. And he turned out to be very loyal and he did very well. So I don't think it's the question of family background, except to the extent that I don't systematically identify myself with the government, unlike most French academic economists, or most French academics.
Are there still old leftists or communists who sympathize with these workers, these working poor?
Not really. The Communist Party as such is almost non-existent now. It's 2% of the vote. I mean, not even that. They didn't have a candidate in the last presidential election. What happened is that there is this big leftist party called La France Insoumise, which is pretty left-wing, and they tried to overtake the Yellow Vest movement. And I think that was a way to neutralize it. It was a way to transform the movement into a bunch of people who were asking for subsidies in order to stay quiet, just like everybody else. So basically, this party participated in the movement so that it would say, look, give us money instead of, give us true democracy with a direct referendum. Because at the end of the day, the feeling of those people is that you have these guys from the elite, they take the plane to go to the Cannes Festival, which is subsidized, the Cannes Cinema Festival, which is subsidized. And then they are lecturing us about global warming, and we pay a huge tax on gasoline, which is making us substantially poorer and making our daily life miserable. And so if you start thinking about these things, you ask yourself, why is that taking place? And of course, the only answer is that there is no real democracy in France, because the people who have a miserable life because of gasoline prices are much more numerous than those who take the plane to go to the Cannes Festival. And so you end up concluding that there is no real democracy, because the people who call themselves the representatives of the people do not represent the people. They represent whatever, the lobbies or the orders, whatever. And so inevitably, you reach the conclusion that the solution to this equation is to have direct democracy, which of course is a very dangerous idea for the ruling class. And that's why they sent these left-wing people from the La France Insoumise, the Mélenchon political party, in order to dilute the movement and kill its basic revendication, which was getting direct democracy.
Let me quote from something you wrote. You say, the Yellow Vest movement is best understood as a hybrid between the U.S. Tea Party movement and Italy's Cinque Stelle. Its position is largely incoherent, reflecting the diversity of its members' motivation to join. But it has two original features compared to what are used to in French agitation tradition. First, the Yellow Vests want less taxes in the form of lower gasoline taxes, but also lower taxes on small business. And second, they want more democracy, in particular in the form of popular initiative referenda. Do you have any prediction for how political life in France is going to evolve?
It's very hard to predict. What I can predict is that it cannot evolve from within. Now we are in a situation where there are only two political parties, if you want. The insiders of the system, or those who think that they are better off as long as the system remains as it is, and those who think that the system has to be dismantled. So I think there is very little scope for reform, basically. The reason why Macron won is that people from the center-right and center-left were scared that they would lose power because of the so-called populists or the so-called extremes. And therefore, they created a sort of single-party system or grand coalition, if you want. So now we are essentially under a single-party system. Either you support the party, or you are a populist, a fascist, an extremist, whatever. This is the present situation. And given that the single party controls the media, the agenda, and so forth, it's very difficult for it to lose power through an election. And what's going on is that more and more people are not participating in the electoral process. So basically, the party, the mainstream, the party in power accounts for at most 25% of the voters, anywhere between 12% of the voters and 25% of the voters. And basically, it survives well because it's good at dividing the remaining 75 or 80%, because it controls the narrative.
Yeah, I didn't realize that the ratio was so stark.
So if change takes place, it will be by some brutal phenomenon, but it will not be because the ruling parties will implement this or that policy.
I would say the U.S. analog is that, according to a U.S. populist, they would say the Republican Party pretends to have some of their interests at heart, but in fact, there's a kind of uniparty which involves the Democrats and then the actual Republicans that are in Washington. And so there's broad range of American opinion that's just not reflected in Washington.
Right. This is quite related to the French situation, except that we no longer have a Republican Party. We have a party called Republican, and their candidates made 4% at the election. So it's as if, I don't know, people like Mitt Romney had 4% of the vote. And we had a socialist candidate from the party of Mitterrand and Jospin and Hollande. And the socialist candidate made 1.6% of the vote. Okay? So the sort of traditional mainstream parties no longer exist. The only thing that remains is Macron. And the reason is that people gathered around Macron because they are scared. So they might have voted socialist, but they thought, look, we run the risk of having no mainstream candidate at the second round. So I vote safe at the first round by voting Macron. So all the other traditional mainstream parties have disappeared, except this France Insoumise, this Mélenchon party, and of course Le Pen, but Le Pen is not a traditional mainstream party. And France Insoumise is considered as a populist too, left-wing populist, even though I think they are really there to support the system. They pretend not to, but they do support the system. They had an opportunity to destabilize the government in parliament by voting some proposition of the Rassemblement National, which is Le Pen, and they didn't do so.
And I think you said Mélenchon is actually just a kind of controlled opposition. Is that right?
Yes.
He's totally, not yes. Really.
Yeah. Right.
I see.
Everybody is a controlled opposition. Le Pen is a sort of controlled opposition, but Le Pen is playing the role of the villain, basically. So if the villain were to win the election, it would be a disaster, even though the villain is just playing a role, but it's not the script of the play, basically. On the other hand, Mélenchon is there to control the people who are socially degraded and might become radicalized. Like people who would naturally become yellow vests, tend to become extreme left-wing. And so he's selling to them some, opium of extreme left-wing. But at the end of the day, when there are important stakes, he's always rallying with the government. So, for example, with this current pension reform, he said the program of Macron was quite clear that he would increase the retirement age to 64, okay? And Le Pen, in our program, said, no, I will not do that. And so what did Mélenchon do? He said, it's a scandal to increase the retirement age to 64. And at the same time, he said, I will never side with Le Pen in my protest against the pension reform, because Le Pen is a fascist. So I oppose this reform, and at the same time, I support it, because if I did not support it, I would side with the fascists. That's the way it works. And so at the end of the day, he's there to convince part of the electorate to accept their fate, because if they don't, they are buttressing the cause of fascism. So that's the narrative that this so-called left-wing party is pushing. And it works very well.
Is there a tension between belief in rational economic actors and the idea that these political parties, the system, can fool average people, divide them, and keep them from pursuing their own interests?
I guess you are right. There is. Now, many people are not fooled, but they are demoralized, right? It's a bit complicated, because in economic voting theory, your vote does not matter because you are so tiny, right? So at the end of the day, maybe it's not that irrational to vote according to your emotions, because you don't control policy.
Yeah, you get some emotional utility or satisfaction, but maybe
Right.
not real world utility.
Exactly. So you watch yourself in the mirror and you said, I fought fascism.
Right.
But the people who vote Macron, they don't think they fought fascism. They think, look, chaos is around the corner. If my pension can be paid for 5 years more, or if my savings plan can be saved for 5 years more thanks to Macron, that's good enough for me, and I vote for Macron. That's the reason. So Macron is the party of fear, essentially. That's the way it works, and it works well. And that is rational. I mean, these people are somewhat rational. They could say, look, in 1789, people destroyed the system, and there were 25 years of chaos and of wars and so forth. So, I'm not going to go through all this trouble if it only benefits my grandchildren. That's a rational calculation. Especially if you are old, right? You are 80, you are not going to sign up for a revolution that will deliver its benefits when you are 90.
It sounds like you're saying this equilibrium can persist for some time.
Yeah, it can persist for a very long time. It can persist forever. It may not. It's hard to predict what's going to happen.
Okay, let's switch gears. Leaving the state of France on a slightly pessimistic note, let's switch gears and talk about your paper, if that's okay.
Of course.
So I understand you wrote this paper a long time ago, 2008, but hopefully we can still discuss it a little bit. The title is Genes, Legitimacy, and Hypergamy. Another look at the economics of marriage. And it struck me as being very much more realistic than any other economics models of marriage that I had seen. For example, like these early Becker models seem, they make a point, but they seem just incredibly simplistic, whereas you account for all kinds of things, including the quality of genes passed on from the parents to the children, the amount of utility a parent derives from the human capital that accumulates in their children, all kinds of things. So I don't know if you feel comfortable just trying to give us a short summary of it to the listener. Would that be okay?
I will try to do my best because it's not necessarily an easy task, okay?
Yes.
So basically, in sociology and in a lot of economics, as I said, they consider a lot of gender differences as social constructs. There is a lot of work on why do women earn less than men, for example. Okay? Well, it's less and less true, by the way, but historically, people were looking at that, and basically there were people saying that is because of discrimination. And then there are people saying, look, no, it's because they have less human capital, but they have less human capital because of low expectations imposed upon them by society. Okay? And then you have people like Becker who are saying, look, it's the sexual division of labor. Women specialize in domestic work. That was decades ago. Men specialize in market work. And then, of course, with time, this is going to go away because there are machines that can do the homework instead. And because productivity growth makes market work more and more attractive for women. And once they switch to market work, the gender wage gap will disappear because they are going to acquire as much human capital as men, basically. So this is the standard narrative, which is not totally wrong if we look at what happened in the last decade. So when I wrote that paper, I came from a different perspective, as I told you, which is that sex matters a lot. And so if you read my model, there are no income differences between men and women, basically. Okay? They have the same distribution of human capital. And so there is no economic asymmetry between men and women. The only asymmetry is biological. So this is, if you want, the starting point of my paper. I want to know how much economic asymmetries I can get in marriage markets, starting from a single biological fact, which is that women have scarce gametes, whereas men have abundant gametes. Okay? And so in my whole analysis, not for the sake of realism, but for the sake of analytical clarity, there is no sexual division of labor. Women make the same money as men. Okay? That's not the issue there. The issue is, who do you marry with? How does the marriage market look like? Okay? And so from there, I bring in a sort of an assumption coming from the reality of nature, which is observed in all animals, which is that it's possible for the most attractive males to mate with many women. Okay? Whereas it's not possible for the most attractive women to mate with as many men. Okay? They can have maybe 20 children, but not more. Okay? In the Mughal Empire, some Mughal emperors had harems with 80,000 wives. Okay? So if you have 80,000 wives, it means that you have 80,000 guys out there who don't have a wife at all. Right? So basically, I build a lot on, lots of discussions, to be totally honest, that I read in the men's rights advocates sphere, basically. That was a source of inspiration. And basically, the idea out there is that you have men that I call alpha males in my paper, that are the most attractive ones, and a woman who mates with those guys gets the best genes for her kids. But in such a situation, like the Mughal emperor, he mates with 18,000 women. His wealth is divided by 18,000 between all of those girls. So, from the point of view of a woman, if you mate with an alpha male, you get good genes for your kids, but you get very little investment in resources from the father in favor of your kids. Okay? So there is a trade-off out there. Is she going to mate with the alpha male and raise her kid on her own, or is she going to mate with a man who is less attractive genetically, but is willing to invest in the child's human capital? And the guy is going to be willing to invest in the child's human capital if he gets something in exchange. And this something in exchange is legitimacy. That is to say, an insurance that the kid is really his. So by assumption, in my paper, there is no, fatherhood as a social construct. You care, if you're a man, you care about your biological kids. You don't care about kids that would not be your biological kids. That's one assumption. Otherwise, there is no problem, right? And so basically, that's the bulk of what's going on in my paper. But women face a trade-off between mating with an alpha male versus and having good genes but poor economic investment in our children, versus mating with a beta male and having not so good genes but more investment in the children, because the beta male would only mate with one woman and invest everything in his kids. So that's the bottom line. And then one of the central results is this hypergamy result, which is that the beta men need to compensate the beta women in a marriage. Okay? And the beta woman needs to be compensated for the opportunity cost of mating with a beta man instead of an alpha man. And so because of this compensation that must take place in economic equilibrium, a marriage with a rich man and a poor woman is more likely to happen than a marriage between a rich woman and a poor man. Okay? So this is the hypergamy result. Because if I'm a rich woman, then I can mate with an alpha male, and I have enough money to invest a lot of human capital in my kids. Okay? So it's not a problem. It's not a problem for me.
So you identify two types of equilibria that can occur, one of which you call the Victorian type,
Right.
in which individuals marry someone more or less of the same rank in the distribution
Exactly.
of...
It's called assortative mating.
Yes. And the other one, which you call the Sex and the City type equilibrium,
Yes.
Women marry men who are better ranked than themselves.
Yes, this is in reference to this show, which may be a bit outdated, but it was popular at some point, where you have very highly successful women living in New York City, and basically, with one exception, they don't mate. One of them tries to mate with a sort of character who is supposed to be extremely rich, and it's this guy or nothing. So in the equilibrium depicted in this TV series, they don't actually mate. Okay? And this is why I called this kind of outcomes Sex and the City, in order to having a sort of entertaining vocabulary. So basically, you are right. There are these two possibilities. You are totally right. And basically, which one prevails depends on the distribution of income. So if the district, one result, which is not actually obvious, I mean, you have to prove it, it's not straightforward, is that when there is more inequality, the Sex and the City equilibrium is more likely to prevail. Okay? And the explanation, it boils down to actually a differential equation, so it's not that easy to interpret. But the bottom line is that when there is a lot of inequality, the wealthy beta males, okay, they are beta, but they are wealthy. They worked hard, built a company, etc. The wealthy beta males become more attractive for the low-skilled women because there is more inequality. So rich people become more attractive as mates compared to poor people. This is what it means to have more inequality. And so the poorer women are going to compete harder with the richer women in order to mate with the richer beta men. Okay? And this competition, if there is enough inequality between people, is going to destroy the Victorian equilibrium because this competition reduces the share of the pie that the most skilled women get from mating one of the most skilled men. This is what's going on in my model. So the guy says, okay, good, you're nice, but I could marry this poor girl who's willing, to have a very small fraction of my money. So why should I marry? So because of this competitive force, the most skilled women end up being better off not marrying a beta man and mating with an alpha man instead. So the Sex and the City equilibrium is a situation where men at the bottom of the distribution of income do not marry, and women at the top of the distribution of income also do not marry. And so the poorest man who marries the poorest woman of all women, and therefore is more highly ranked than the woman he marries. Whereas in the Victorian equilibrium, everybody marries somebody of the same rank.
So when I read your paper, I didn't realize you when you wrote it that you were already aware of these arguments being made kind of in the popular internet sphere among, I guess you would call them manosphere people.
Yeah, right. No, I was aware of these things, and I thought it was, quite interesting because this vision of how things work was very different from the views prevailing in academia. So it was an opportunity to study these things and to study them from a rigorous point of view.
So it seems to me the model is very reasonable in general. It didn't seem like you formulated the model in order to reach the conclusion of the manosphere.
No, I didn't want to reach a specific conclusion, and there are some predictions that say that maybe the Sex and the City equilibrium is better for growth than the Victorian equilibrium. It depends on the parameters. So basically, in the manosphere, as you call it, the decline of marriage is going to lead to the decline of civilization. That's possible, but in my model, it's not the case. Of course, in economics, we are very narrow-minded, but if by civilization you mean GDP, I do not have a general result that the Sex and the City equilibrium has a lower GDP than the Victorian equilibrium. It depends, actually.
As I was looking at your model, one of the parameters which I found extremely interesting is something called gamma, which is the coefficient of the contribution of the human capital accumulated in the children in its contribution to the utility of the parent. So it's basically how much the parents care about the success of their children. Am I right about that?
Right.
And it seems like, going back to the manosphere, there are these cads versus dads. So the dads would be people with high gamma, and the cads would be people with basically zero gamma.
Yeah, in my model, everybody has gamma, but the cads do not know. The cads are the alphas in my model, and the cads don't know who their kids are.
I see. So in your model, if you have a kid but you don't know who they are,
if you don't know who your kid is, you cannot invest in his or her human capital. This is what's going on.
I see. Got it.
So basically, one important component of that model is that as a male, you can only know that your kids are your kids, provided you have signed an enforceable contract with a woman who says it's your kid. And the alphas, they accept all the mating opportunities, but they do not have those marriage contracts, at least not necessarily each time. So they don't know that the kids of the women with whom they mate are necessarily their kids. And in some sense, it's a little bit a stretch of imagination. It's a little bit of a modeling trick, but they care about their kids without knowing them. So they are better off when they have more kids, if you want. But given that they don't know their kids, they cannot invest in their human capital. They wish they could, but they cannot.
I see.
So these are the cads in my model. Everybody has the same gamma by assumption. Of course, I could have imagined another model where things take place as you say. Okay? There is a gamma for the dads and a gamma equals 0 for the cats. But in my model, it's not what's going on. You have the same gamma, but you behave as a cat because you don't know who your true genetic offspring are.
Yes. I noticed the preprint was in 2008 and the published version is 2015. Did you have a difficult time with the referees?
Well, yeah, it was rejected by countless journals for a number of reasons that you may have in your own field, which used to be less salient in economics, but now economics is an academic discipline where people are territorial, and historically it's not my field. So if you're a newcomer in one subfield, then it's tough, right? Because people don't like newcomers. So there is this aspect which made it difficult to publish. The insiders in this field were not particularly interested in having people migrating from other fields. It's a general problem, I think.
Yeah,
And then, of course, the other issue could be problematic in light of political correctness. That being said, there's a guy whom you might want to interview, David Delacroix, who actually is the editor of the journal that published my paper. He did excellent work on the economics of polygamy, and he publishes very well.
I see. So it was a mix of anti-outsider bias and political correctness.
I think so.
Yeah, I think both effects exist for sure.
Yes.
Good. Well, I've taken up a lot of your time. I think we're well over an hour. Are there any final things you'd like to say? My audience is mostly, I guess, Anglophone scientists, professors, and startup people, entrepreneurs. Any wisdom you care to impart as a last message?
Well, maybe I could say one last thing about this paper.
Yes.
There is a last section which looks at sexual repression. And sexual repression is a social norm which forces people to marry. And if you have such a social norm or such a law, then you always end up at the Victorian equilibrium. Okay? And so one way I interpret what's going on in the West is that going back to May 68, sexual repression was overturned in those years. And so the social norm of having to marry disappeared. And we are in a situation where Western society is gradually moving out of the Victorian equilibrium in the direction of the sex and the city equilibrium. It's still the case. If you look at the data, things are never as clear in the model as in the model. It's clear that men at the bottom of the income distribution have trouble marrying, which is what my model predicts. For women at the top of the income distribution, things are more complex, right? Because they still marry a lot, but it's also true that they tend to divorce a lot. So the sex and the city phenomenon seems to appear in the form of high divorce rate as opposed to low marriage rates. So I wanted to just to complete the discussion about this paper. I wanted to mention this.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I think just as an amateur sociologist, I would say, yes, for sure, the social mores have changed and have allowed, I think the SATC, Sex and the City lifestyle just would not have been approved of, even 1 or 2 generations ago.
Right.
Does the equilibrium have any effect on TFR, the reproductive rate, overall reproductive rate?
That's not something my model allows to look at. Because in my model, and maybe this is a bit ahead of reality, although again, there are signs of it, but the high-skilled women do not marry, but they do have children from alpha males. So there's no prediction that fertility should fall. So, of course, it's an interesting phenomenon, but my model is not constructed to address this phenomenon.
Yep, I understand. But I think a lot of the same people in the manosphere probably would argue that the Victorian equilibrium leads to higher TFR than the other one. But I understand.
Sure, but there are plenty of arguments. There are people who say that fertility falls because of social security. You don't need children to pay for your old age consumption. And of course, this has nothing to do with marriage markets. So there are plenty of trends that might be used to explain the fall in fertility. And of course, there is no scarcity of sociological or psychological explanations, selfishness, atheism, and so on and so forth.
Are you familiar with the work of an economic historian named Greg Clark at UC Davis?
I've heard of it, yes.
You might be interested in him because he claims to show, using all kinds of marriage records, very deep and old data sets, that assortative mating is extremely strong, actually, and has been happening for, at least in England, where he has most of his data, hundreds and hundreds of years.
Right. In my model, there is perfect assortative mating. Both equilibria are completely assortative. That is to say, richer men marry richer women. It's simply that the SATC is highly hypergamic, unlike the Victorian equilibrium. That is to say, women are poorer than their husbands in the SATC equilibrium. But it's still very assortative. If I'm richer, I will marry a woman with a higher human capital. This is what it means to be assortative.
Yes. So I should have said something more specific, which is I think he has evidence that generally, women from a particular strata are marrying men from the same strata, or similar strata. So it's more like the Victorian equilibrium in the past, maybe not today, but in the past it was more like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Now the question of the extent to which we are moving to an SATC equilibrium remains, of course, an open question. And also, the strata itself is endogenous, because if I talk about that in my paper, if you are not going to get married, you have lower incentives to accumulate human capital. So you are going to be downgraded in terms of strata.
Yes.
So what we observe a lot, for example, substantially, is women who marry men from the same strata, but the man earns more than the woman. She's a teacher and is a lawyer, something like that, or a doctor. This is what we observe. So it's the same strata, but what do we mean by that?
Yeah, in his work, there's a very technical way of defining what you mean by the strata. And even by looking at large biobanks, you can even see how correlated are the polygenic scores of two married individuals.
Right.
So you might find his work interesting. It does actually connect to yours in certain ways.
Okay, so it remains to be, it's clear that historically the Victorian equilibrium prevailed, if any, because there were strong social norms against, single motherhood and so forth.
Yes.
Now it's no longer the case, and we would like to know the extent to which society is moving towards something resembling more Sex and the City equilibrium.
Yes. Well, part of the reason I was interested in your paper is because this is not so much about marriage, but more about mating. If you look at the data science around what is actually happening on Tinder and all these other dating apps, they apparently support very strongly an insane amount of hypergamy when it comes to mating.
Right.
And so that's why I thought, when I saw your paper, I thought, wow, this guy, I later realized you're not necessarily talking about mating, but you're talking about marriage. But my initial reaction was, wow, this guy predicted this long ago. So just mistaken. But anyway.
Right. And that's a comparatively new phenomenon.
Yes.
Because in the traditional society, people, they were those arranged marriages, and they were quite assaulted.
Yes. Well, very good. I've taken up lots of your time. I really appreciate you staying up to talk to me. And any final message that you want to give to my listeners?
No, I guess it's fine for now.
Okay. Well, Gilles, thank you very much.
Going to have dinner.
Yes. I wish you a good evening.
Thank you very much for contacting me.
Yes.